On 29th September 2021, senior officials, military officials of the United States and China had a virtual meeting, this being the first meeting that the United States military and the Chinese military have had at a senior level since the Biden-Harris administration took office. I should say that the Biden-Harris administration has been making repeated attempts to try to establish some kind of dialogue with the Chinese military almost since it took office. It has come up against a wall of rejection and refusal from China and from the Chinese, and with no progress being made, this first conversation happening now must be seen as something of a breakthrough, at least from the American point of view. Having said that, it's also clear that the conversation was extremely tense and might even have amounted to a row. Now, I'm going to illustrate this and explain this by going through the various readouts and statements that the US and Chinese governments have given about this conversation. Firstly, let me begin by the readout that was published by the United States Department of Defense, and it reads as follows. Dr. Michael Chase, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China, conducted a secure video conference with Major General Huang Suiping, Deputy Director of the People's Republic of China's People's Liberation Army Office for International Military Cooperation, to co-host virtually the 16th US PRC Defense Policy Coordination Talks, 28th and 29th September 2021. The meeting is an important component of the Biden-Harris administration's ongoing efforts to responsibly manage the competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China by maintaining open lines of communication with the PRC. During the talks, the two sides held a frank, in-depth and open discussion on a range of issues affecting the US-PRC defense relationship. Both sides reaffirmed consensus to keep communication channels open. The US also made our commitment to uphold shared principles with our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, the key words here are the words the two sides held a frank, in-depth and open discussion. As I have explained many times, there is a protocol, or if you like, a language to readouts, and the words frank, when they appear in a readout of a diplomatic exchange, suggest something akin to a row. In other words, it's clear that there was no real agreement or consensus reached by the two sides over the course of these conversations. Instead, there was clearly an exchange of positions, probably accompanied by some very harsh rhetoric by each side towards the other. In other words, though they have agreed to speak and communicate with each other, they've agreed about absolutely nothing else. And we can get a flavour of that also from a discussion, of the call that took place, a description of the call provided by China's Defense Ministry spokesman, Wu Qian, in a news conference, a regular news conference held at the Defense Ministry in Beijing shortly after this conversation took place. And I will read out both the question and the response from Wu Qian. I should say that the question almost certainly was placed by a Chinese media journalist and was almost certainly coordinated with the Chinese Defense Ministry in advance. Anyway, it reads as follows. On September 10th, when President Xi Jinping had a telephone conversation with United States President Biden at an appointment, he pointed out that the relevant departments of the two countries can continue to contact and dialogue to add more positive factors to the relations between the two countries. According to Reuters, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the US Department of Defense spoke with the leader of the International Military Cooperation Office of the Central Military Commission not long ago. US Department of Defense officials revealed that this is the first time a senior defense official of the Biden administration has held talks with the Chinese military. Despite the tension between the two countries, the communication between the United States and China has not been armed forces has not been interrupted. What's China's comment on this? Now, note the way in which this question is framed. It makes it absolutely clear that this discussion between senior defense officials of the United States and China is a follow-up to the conversation which took place a short time ago between President Biden and President Xi Jinping. In other words, the one thing that did come out of that conversation between Biden and Xi Jinping was an agreement that the defense ministries of the two countries would communicate with each other. Now, this is something the United States has been pushing for, and it's clear that the Xi-Biden telephone call at least managed to break that particular part of the logjam. Anyway, this is what Wu Qian said in response to the question. The military relationship between China and the United States is an important part of the relationship between the two countries. As we all know, due to the continuous provocation and containment of China by the United States, the relationship between the Chinese and American armed forces has faced many difficulties and challenges, but the two armed forces have always maintained communication. On August 19th, the leaders of the Office of International Military Cooperation of the Central Military Commission conducted a video call with the Assistant Secretary of the United States Department of Defense. So you see that the Chinese are saying, well, it's not absolutely true, we've had no communications. There was a discussion back in August. And then it continues as follows. From September 28th to 29th, the leaders of the Office of International Military Cooperation of the Central Military Commission and the Assistant Secretary of the US Department of Defense co-hosted the 16th China-US Defense Department working meeting via video. In the two exchanges mentioned above, the two sides exchanged in-depth views on the relations between the two countries and the two militaries and issues of common concern. The Chinese side has said many times that there is a principle for us to develop relations between the two militaries, that is, China's sovereignty, dignity, and core interests cannot be violated. Regarding the relationship between the two armed forces, we welcome communication, welcome cooperation, face differences, and oppose coercion. We have always been open-minded and have always done what we say. On the other hand, the United States has serious problems in its self-awareness, its perception of China, and its perception of the world today. This is the root cause of the current difficult situation in the relations between the two countries and the armed forces. There is an American proverb, to do the right thing anytime is a good time. We hope that the United States will show courage, correct its mistakes, and work with China to answer the mandatory question of how to do a good job in Sino-US relations so as to benefit the two peoples and the people of the world together. So that is what the Chinese Defense Ministry spokesman Wu Qian had to say about this call. Now, we've had also comments from Admiral Kirby, who is the Defense Secretary, the Department of Defense press spokesman in Washington. And this is what Admiral Kirby is reported to have said. And it's very brief. It was over the course of a very long press conference dealing mainly with Afghan events. But this is what he said. And as I said, it's very brief, far more brief than what the Chinese are saying about this discussion. I think you saw that we gave a readout out of that meeting. I won't go beyond that, but I know I have nothing on the schedule to announce with respect to the Secretary's engagement. This was an important first step in the communications process, and again, as we read it out, we found that exchange to be productive, and I won't go beyond that today. So clearly, a very tense meeting, a very prolonged meeting lasting over 2 days, a meeting in which officials, not just these two officials that have been mentioned, but several officials of the United States and Chinese military exchanged views with each other. The Chinese are trying to make out that this isn't actually the break in the logjam that the United States says it is. As a matter of fact, I think that on this, the US is right. Maybe there was a meeting in August, but clearly that was not at a very senior level, or at least it wasn't a very productive meeting. The United States has not been able to conduct the kind of intense dialogue with the Chinese military that it's been seeking ever since the Biden-Harris administration took office. Its attempts to send senior military officials to China to meet with Chinese officials have all been spurned, and this was the first occasion following directly from the Biden-Xi conversation that a conversation of some sort between the Chinese and the US military that was substantive finally took place. But the Chinese were not making any concessions at this meeting. The meeting seems to have become heated, thus the word frank in the American readout, and it's quite clear from what the Chinese Defense Ministry spokesman says that the Chinese, in effect, read out to the United States what could be discussed as a list of American transgressions, making it very clear that China is not in any mood to compromise on anything of substance, and that it is for the United States to make all the important and serious concessions. Now, why has this meeting taken place? Why is the United States trying so hard to open up some sort of dialogue with Beijing? What was the topic that was discussed? What was the actual topic which was discussed over the course of this conversation? Now, there's a few things to say. First of all, clearly there is a deteriorating situation, or a very difficult situation, in the South China Sea. The Chinese have again complained recently about what they see as the provocative actions of a US frigate in the South China Sea. They're also extremely unhappy. The Chinese are also still extremely unhappy about movements of American and allied forces close to Taiwan. There was complaints from China about that. It is inconceivable that the topic of the South China Sea and Taiwan was not discussed over the course of these conversations. And most probably, that was the issue that the Chinese brought out and hammered away at over the course of these talks, telling the United States repeatedly that these movements of US warships and of allied warships in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Straits are, as far as China is concerned, unacceptable and dangerously provocative. But what was the United States seeking in these talks? And it's quite clear that it's the United States that's been pushing for this dialogue with China for several months now, and has up to now been coming up against a brick wall. Well, I think we have an explanation in a long article that has just appeared again in the National Interest. Now, this is a realist magazine, which is, or at least purports to be, a realist magazine amongst the multiplicity of foreign policy magazines which appear in the United States and which are churned out by the US foreign policy and defense and NGO and think tank community. But this particular wing, if you like, of that community seeks to pursue what it sees as a somewhat more realistic perspective of international problems. And what this long article in National Interest, which I'm not going to actually read out because it's very long, but I will highlight some points in it. what this particular article is basically saying is that the United States faces a major strategic crisis. And that crisis originates from the fact that the military nuclear balance between the superpowers is shifting against the United States. And the article is headlined, "The Nuclear Balance is Changing and Not for the Better." And then the article goes on to say that the rise of China's nuclear forces, added to Russia's exotic new nuclear systems, refers to its hypersonic systems, the Poseidon nuclear-powered submarine drone, the VanHerck nuclear-powered cruise missile, and all the rest, is raising considerable concern in the United States for two separate but highly interconnected reasons. This rise in power poses a few questions. Is the nuclear force structure that America is planning to rebuild and modernize adequate enough to deter these threats? Is the New START arms control deal that America just extended for another 5 years with Russia in danger of becoming irrelevant? What is the new threat that America faces, and is it serious? The answer is yes, it is serious. And then the article goes on to discuss the somewhat controversial issue of the new silo construction fields in China, which have been detected by commercial satellites. It takes it as fact that these silo fields are intended to house intercontinental ballistic missiles, and it talks about a major increase in China's nuclear deterrent capability, putting it at the same level, potentially, as those of the United States and Russia. And that it makes the point that the United States is struggling to keep up with this growth in the nuclear power, in China's nuclear deterrent power, whilst at the same time it finds itself tied to a nuclear treaties, nuclear limitation treaties with Russia, which in effect tie its hands in responding to this rise, this growth of Chinese nuclear military power. And it then goes on to say that this is creating for the United States a strategic crisis, and that the United States doesn't entirely know how to respond to this. And it comes up with some kind of suggestions. It again looks to try and find some means of getting the Russians and the Chinese to limit their nuclear forces in a way that would be equal, would make them jointly equal to those of the United States. It talks about the difficulties that the United States faces in increasing the number of its nuclear forces. And then it ends by suggesting rather bitterly that perhaps the United States has no real alternative option but to start building up its nuclear forces on the basis that it is in direct competition with both the Chinese and the Russians at the same time, and that it needs to race, in effect, with both of them simultaneously, causing the entire architecture of arms control between the United States and Russia to disintegrate. And it has these rather sad comments. The conventional wisdom is that Russia and China won't gang up on the United States and cooperatively threaten it with nuclear force. However, as noted expert Stephen Blank has explained, Russia and China are increasingly working together on military matters. They are even doing joint military exercises. Even some disarmament experts have acknowledged that if a conflict in the Pacific over Taiwan emerged involving the United States and China, for example, it is not just speculation that Russia might decide that aggression against the Baltics would be in the cards if the United States was otherwise distracted or busy answering aggression occurring in the Pacific region. So this sets out, highlights the US dilemma. Now, a short while ago, I discussed another article which appeared in National Interest, which also admitted to the existence of this dilemma, to the fact that the United States is now faced with a nuclear arms race against China in the Pacific and with a nuclear arms race against Russia in Europe and the Atlantic, and that it is facing this problem, and that the aggregate resources of the Chinese and the Russians is such that the United States would struggle to keep up with them if it was faced with a competition against both of them at the same time, and that this is something that the United States needs to find a way to avoid. And that particular article, which also appeared, by the way, in the National Interest, basically suggested that the United States redouble its pressure on Russia, sought to break Russia in effect, in order to redirect Russia to focus instead of focusing on Europe, to focus on the Pacific and Siberia, and once more become, in effect, a kind of vassal state of the United States as it was in the 1990s. And I said that that particular article was absolutely hopeless. There was no conceivable way that it could be, that kind of idea could ever be made to work. Well, this latest article in the National Interest, Peter Hussey, doesn't indulge in those sort of fantasies, but neither does it really offer an alternative. It doesn't seem to know exactly how the United States is going to respond to this perceived rise of Chinese nuclear power at the same time that the United States is still tied down by its arms control regime that it has agreed with Russia in Europe and in the North Atlantic. And I suspect that this is what the United States is pressing the Chinese about. It's trying to speak to China about nuclear weapons limitation. It's trying to get the Chinese to agree to limits on Chinese nuclear forces as part of some kind of major stabilization exercise in the Pacific. But it is coming up against the fact that the Chinese absolutely refuse to play ball. What the Chinese say is that as far as they're concerned, their nuclear deterrent is only a fraction of those of the United States and Russia. The United States is, as far as China is concerned, the country which is putting pressure on China, which is trying to contain China, which is running a campaign against China. That China has every right, therefore, to take whatever steps it needs and wishes in order to defend itself, and that if that means increasing the number of its nuclear forces, well, so be it. There is no way that the Chinese are going to negotiate about that. Now, that, of course, creates a strategic crisis for the United States. Now, the other option that they have is to try to get the Russians to agree to cutbacks in their strategic forces, or to try to get the Russians to agree to involve China in the strategic arms negotiations. But the Russians have consistently refused to agree to this, and we've just learnt that the Russians have agreed with the United States, working parties on strategic arms limitation, but the TASS dispatch makes it fairly clear that this will be purely on the basis of equality, the same sort of equality that has prevailed between Russia and the United States ever since the middle years of the Cold War. So there is no obvious or easy way for the United States out of this dilemma. It continues to try to negotiate with China about arms control, only to find that the Chinese are not interested, and it is more successful to some extent in negotiating with the Russians, but the Russians are not interested in helping the United States out of its Pacific problems. So what does the United States do in this situation? Well, I think we have got the sense of what the Chinese wanted to do from the comments made by Wu Qian. Now, he has spelled out in some detail that as far as China is concerned, they probably would be willing to enter into some kind of strategic dialogue with the United States. They're open to negotiation, they're open to talks, but they do demand from the United States substantive concessions on the hot-button political issues that concern China. That is to say, Taiwan and the South China Sea. And to go back to his words, the Chinese side has said many times that there is a principle for us to develop relations between the two militaries. That is, China's sovereignty, dignity, and core interests cannot be violated. Now, note that the word sovereignty, as far as China is concerned, includes sovereignty over Taiwan. And when a Chinese official says that that cannot be violated, he says that the United States must, in effect, not only recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, the United States, of course, has already done that, but it must make no step that appears to support or countenance any step on the part of Taiwan to declare independence from China, either in publicly by way of an open announcement of independence, or through some other means, like setting up, for example, Taiwan representative offices in Washington, or providing Taiwan with some kind of economic or military help that would treat Taiwan, in effect, as a country independent of China. So that is a condition that the Chinese are insisting upon as part of any kind of arms control dialogue. Moreover, I am going to go further and say that the Chinese, for their part, are almost certainly going to insist that any arms limitation which they agree with the United States is going to be on the same sort of principle of equality as the arms control regime with the United States that first the Soviet Union and now Russia have negotiated. In other words, China will possess such number of nuclear weapons as it deems necessary. The Russians and the Americans can agree whatever they choose. The Chinese might agree to limits of those, but under no circumstances will they agree to a situation where the United States is equal or superior to China and Russia simultaneously, thus locking China into an inferior position. So that is, I think, what the United States encountered over the course of these talks. I suspect it found that the Chinese on this position were not prepared to move an inch, and that this is why Admiral Kirby, though he says that the talks were constructive, is not prepared to discuss in any great detail what was said over the course of them, and why the readout, the American readout, says that the talks were frank and open, which suggests a very tough and perhaps sometimes acrimonious exchange of views. So it looks like deadlock. Some communication, some breakthrough in breaking through the logjam, but the which had previously meant communication between the United States and China was not taking place. But once that logjam was broken, the United States comes up against an unyielding Chinese position. Now, what is going to happen? I mean, I think, first of all, the thing to say is that I think it is in everybody's interest, eventually, to agree to some sort of limitation, nuclear arms limitation arrangement. We are at serious risk, as the National Interest article says, of an uncontrolled nuclear arms race, with the United States trying to compete against China and Russia simultaneously, with China and Russia then increasing their own weapon systems at the same kind of frenetic pace that they've shown that they can do, with the United States perhaps worrying or becoming increasingly concerned that the superior manufacturing capability that China possesses and the tremendous technological skills that Russia possesses could put it in a position of long-term disadvantage, and with the United States therefore taking steps which, shall we say, might be dangerous and unwise. So some sort of arms limitation arrangement is possible. But I think that the United States does need eventually to accept some measure of reality about this. It needs to accept that there have to be those concessions over Taiwan and the South China Sea that the Chinese are demanding. As I've said before, I don't think the United States needs to completely sell the shop on these things. I think the United States, for example, can perhaps insist on guarantees or protections for Taiwan, perhaps off-the-record protections, who knows what. But I don't think it needs to completely sell out Taiwan. But I certainly think it needs to give up any idea that it can support Taiwanese independence from China. And I think it also needs to accept that the issues of the South China Sea are going to be settled by China with its neighbours and not involve the United States directly. And I think also the United States may find that it has to make analogous concessions to Russia in Europe. The Russians have recently been talking clearly about their core interests, and we've now had further statements from Putin in talks with the Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko that certain steps with respect to Ukraine, for example, Ukraine's admission into NATO, or the deployment of US missile systems in Ukraine, that those cross Russian red lines and that the Russians will respond strongly to them. And I think the United States needs to accept that, and it needs to understand that the Russians have red lines and it needs to abide by them. And I think at some point over the next 5-10 years, we will reach that stage when the United States does come round to an acceptance of these facts. But I have to say, I'm far from confident of this, and I'm also happy to say that I doubt very much that that's going to happen anytime soon. Certainly not within the next 5 or 10 years, certainly not during the lifetime of this administration. In the meantime, it seems to me we have a rocky ride before us as the United States and China and Russia struggle to contain this competition between them, which is, to be straightforward about it, certainly at the level of arms control, now threatening to spiral out of control. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I have to rush off now to do all sorts of things, other things for the Duran, but I hope you've learned something from this program. If so, please remember to press the like button to this video and check your subscription to this channel. And please also, in that case, support us by going to our Locals channel on our new Locals platform, which is now thriving and very active, and by also checking us out on our various other platforms, BitChute, Library, ODYSEE, Rumble, SuperU, and the rest, and by coming also to our shop and buying the things you will find there. Well, thank you again for joining me today. I hope, as I said, that you have a good day, and I look forward to you joining me again soon.